The morning call begins right now. The recent uprisings against long-term presidents in Algeria and Sudan highlights the dangers of presidents for life. The ouster of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika and Omar al-Bashir raises the question whether Africa is indeed changing its perceptions of strongmen and leaders who have overstayed their welcome. Protests in these countries against the long-time regimes clearly indicate that ordinary citizens have had enough and want real institutional change. But what message does it send to the remaining autocrats and dictators? It should be noted that Africa is home to some of the world's longest-serving heads of state, some for more than 3 decades. But for how long will they continue clinging to power? A few examples are worth mentioning in this context. Teodoro Obiangema in Equatorial Guinea, Paul Biya in Cameroon, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, Republic of Congo's Denis Sassou Nguesso, Idriss Déby Itno in Chad, just to mention but a few.
Are we heading towards the end of 30-year-old regimes in Africa? This is the question that haunts observers following the double uprising of populations in Algeria and Sudan. In Africa, the lengthened stay in power of heads of states is no longer news. There is a risk of revolution against such regimes, as we can see.
Well, Joshua Mersave is a senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Good to have you in the program, Joshua. So the ousting of Algerian and the Sudanese heads of state are both different in context. But what lesson does this pose for African long-term autocrats and dictators?
Well, I think there's a couple lessons that dictators or autocrats can take away from what's happening in Sudan and Algeria. One is that a ruler cannot continue to ignore its people, to repress its people, to frustrate its people's ambitions indefinitely. At some point, there will be a reckoning. Particularly in this day and age, I think, when there are so many examples around the country that citizens can look to and say, well, the population of this country was able to do it, so we can do it too. So I think that's one of the primary lessons. I also think, and perhaps this is more hopeful, or this is me being hopeful, but I hope that another lesson that autocrats are taking away is that superficial reforms will not be enough. We're seeing these protests continue in Algeria and Sudan, even though the figureheads of those regimes have left, because the protesters rightly recognize that until there is systemic change, until the entire regime has reformed or left, there won't be the types of reforms that the protesters are demanding.
Joshua, do you sense more turbulence in these regions as citizens and regimes attempt to renegotiate?
I do, unfortunately. I think Sudan in particular has a real chance to become quite unsettled, even more so than it is already now. The protesters are not leaving. They understand that just simply replacing the figurehead of a brutal regime is not good enough. So they're continuing their demands, they're continuing their protests. And the military regime there that now controls the country is not going to make the sorts of reforms that will see it lose power. So there are two immovable forces here at the moment. You have the protesters and the military regime, neither one of which is backing down. So I think that bodes very poorly for security in that country, stability in that country. And then there's also, I think there's going to be ferment, and we're already seeing it within the military, within the security apparatus, within the regime of the country itself, as different sources of power, different bases of power compete with each other for ultimate influence.
And how would you describe the place of youthful populations in repressive regions in Africa faced with rampant unemployment, Joshua?
Yeah, that's, of course, one of the primary sources of grievance in these countries and in the Arab Spring countries that preceded what's happening in Sudan and Algeria. You have gross economic mismanagement by the regime. You have corruption that sucks away chances from ordinary people. And you have no plan, really, for these regimes are sclerotic, they're entrenched, and they don't appear to have any plan for bettering the lot of the ordinary people. And particularly when you have so many young people in these various countries, the frustrations of that class have grown and grown and grown over the decades as the regime has consistently failed to deliver for them. So unemployment's very high. Just a lack of opportunity is rife throughout these countries, and ultimately the youth in particular said they had had enough.